So how do you play the disruption innovation game? Well, it's hard to defend against disruptive innovation when it's so hard to predict which technologies are going to be disruptive. But the real problem is there are two types of disruptive innovation, and while one of them is predictable, the other is not. So let's look at how to address this deeper problem with the help of a power map. We start with the vertical axis describing the firm's value chain, the activities and practices it performs to create value for its customers and other users. We also have a horizontal axis, describing how things are changing in the wider industry, what we call evolution. Combining these two axes gives us a power map. A power map is an effective tool for seeing what's going on in a competitive environment and understanding how it's changing. With a power map, you can create effective responses. Power maps, which are based on Wardley maps, are used to identify opportunities, reduce waste, and create real strategy. In this video, we're going to focus on how to create a real strategy by showing you how to play the disruptive innovation game more effectively. The classic definition of disruptive innovation comes from Clayton Christensen in his famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma. He described disruptive innovation as an ongoing process where inferior but cheaper alternatives take root at the lower end of the market, after which they move up the value chain and eventually displace established players who'd overlooked them. He explained that disruptive innovation happens when established players overshoot the market. A company focuses on sustaining innovation, that is, incrementally improving the performance of their product over time. But the pace of technological change means products or services can quickly outperform the customer's ability to use them. This is when companies overshoot the market. At this point, a disruptive alternative appears. This is not superior technology, but is often inferior in performance, which is why rivals ignore it at first. But it soon starts to do the job well enough at significantly less cost. It then reaches a point where its performance matches the capability of the customers to utilize it. They then start to switch to the cheaper alternative, and the market leader starts to be disrupted. So disruptive innovation is not about a dramatic new technology. It's more about how well a product or service connects with customers. And this is hard to predict, which is why even the guru of disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen, got it wrong when he said Apple wouldn't succeed with the iPhone. Let's look at why Christensen got it wrong with the help of a simplified map of the telephone industry. On the left, we have the Makuuchi telephone, which in 1849 was the first telephone, an uncharted component that would have been unusual and unpredictable. Over time, the telephone found a market, and through supply and demand competition, it evolved through various iterations. In 1992, we get the first mobile phone from Nokia, and then, in 2007, Apple launched the first touchscreen phone, the iPhone. Now, Christensen thought Apple wouldn't succeed with the iPhone because it was just a late entry into the already crowded mobile phone industry. The iPhone was simply not disruptive and would struggle to find customers. But like all components, Apple's iPhone consists of multiple subcomponents, a camera, processors, software and a screen, that make up the iPhone's value chain, the chain of activities and practices it performs that creates something of value. Now, one of those components, the touchscreen, had gone from being custom-built, something a bit experimental, to a more stable and therefore reliable product. And when the mobile computing revolution erupted, customers found that the larger touchscreen made the iPhone a great alternative to carrying around a laptop. So the iPhone was disruptive, but not to the mobile phone industry. It was disruptive to the computer laptop industry. It was an inferior computer in many ways, but it was good enough for what the users wanted, which was mobile computing. The iPhone did kill its major rivals in the mobile phone industry, but this wasn't classical disruption, it was evolution. Mobiles evolved from phones that did some computing, like the BlackBerry, to mobile computers that also made calls. This is product evolution, and it relies on hidden moves in a rival's value chain, like a new touchscreen, and whether customers find a use for it. And this is impossible to predict, even for Clayton Christensen, the guru of disruptive innovation. And we call this Type 1 disruptive innovation. Your only defense against Type 1 disruptive innovation is to learn how to respond quickly to change, and that also requires you to become a highly adaptive organization. However, there is also Type 2 disruption, which is highly predictable and therefore something you can use to your strategic advantage. A prime example of this is what happened around the same time Apple launched the iPhone. In 2006, Amazon launched EC2, in other words, cloud computing, which would go on to disrupt the entire computer industry. Like phones, computing has also evolved from the earliest computers through to the commodity-like servers IBM was selling at the turn of the century. But a mature product isn't the end of the evolution journey. Something comes after that disrupts the entire industry, as Amazon did with cloud computing. There are 4 weak signals you can look for that tell you when an industry is ripe for disruption. Firstly, the idea for turning a mature product into a utility service needs to exist. For example, the provision of electricity and water. The idea for computing as a utility service has been around since at least 1966, with Douglas Parkhill's book discussing the challenge of the computer utility. In 2003, even IBM was investing into the idea of computing as a utility service. What they called grid computing would dramatically reduce the cost of computing power, which is partly why they didn't do it. Secondly, the technology to provide the product as a utility needs to exist. At that time, academic and research facilities had been using shared computing power for some time, so the technology challenge wasn't a problem. Thirdly, the market attitude had to be ripe for a utility service, which happens when there's dissatisfaction with the perceived value for money of existing offerings. It was easy to show how cloud computing could provide huge cost savings, as people could just pay for what they used and didn't need to buy and manage their own computing infrastructure. And finally, there has to be a suitable offering that brings all of this together in a way that customers can understand and trust. Amazon was able to test this on themselves first, as they were huge users of computing processing power because of their online store. If they could meet their own needs, they knew they had something that would satisfy the wider market as well. And that's why Amazon was the first to provide computing as a utility service. IBM was stuck behind their inertia barriers, making too much money selling servers in a growing market. This made them blind to the changing customer attitudes. And why was this important? Well, the greater efficiency of using a utility-like service, where you only pay for what you use, led to an explosion of new emerging practices. Some of these led to entirely new industries, like mobile computing, as you no longer needed your own server, everything could be done on the cloud. And all this activity took place on Amazon's platforms. They became the computing power equivalent of electricity. And remarkably, not one of their competitors made a move against them for 7 years. They simply conceded the future to Amazon, which has been very profitable for the former bookseller. Amazon's market capitalization in 2006, when it launched its cloud services, was nearly 5 times smaller than IBM. Within 7 years, Amazon had overtaken the computing giant and has pulled away from them ever since. In 2021, Amazon is a $1 trillion company, whilst IBM's market capitalization has remained relatively flat over time. Owning the utility service on which the future is built was the smart move that Amazon saw, but others didn't. Others were playing the disruption game blindfolded, unable to see the landscape and listening to those who were telling them that cloud computing was overhyped. This is Type 2 disruption, where a product like servers is substituted by a utility service like cloud. Unlike Type 1 disruption, Type 2 is entirely predictable because it's the result of aggregated forces on the market. But it requires better situational awareness to see it, a map to see what's happening and pay attention to what's changing. Unfortunately, most companies over-focus on Type 1 disruption and completely ignore the far bigger opportunity of Type 2 disruption. So remember, there are 2 types of disruption and you need to play them both differently. Don't try and predict Type 1 disruption. It's unpredictable, but it's also short-lived. If a rival releases an improved product, then learn to be a fast follower so you can quickly release your own version and negate any benefits they may have gained. But you can predict Type 2 disruption through weak signals, and these advantages are long-lived. It's hard to compete against the platform on which the future is built, so you need to be a first mover and own this space before others do. So if you're playing the disruption game, learn to understand the two types of disruption first and the strategic options available to you. Having maps will help you become aware of where you can attack and defend yourself against rival moves by learning how to adapt quicker. If you'd like to learn how to increase your awareness and adaptivity, go to powermaps.net and see what we can do for you.